If you heard shrieking or weeping or wailing or gnashing of teeth this past week, it may have been the audible response from the liberals and the radical feminists in response to what is certain to be a defining moment in American history. Health officials at the University of Alabama at Birmingham said earlier this week they would pause all in vitro fertilization treatments following a ruling by the Alabama Supreme Court which extended legal protections to frozen embryos used in the procedure of IVF, in vitro fertilization. The Daily Wire has the details of the case. The Alabama Supreme Court ruled late last week that frozen embryos should be recognized and protected as unborn children, as several couples sue a fertility clinic over the destruction of frozen embryos. In an 8-1 ruling, the court said that the state's Wrongful Death of a Minor Act applies to frozen embryos because the law protects all children regardless of their location. The justices rooted their decision in the clause of Alabama's Constitution that says that the public policy of the state is to uphold the sanctity of unborn life. The ruling came after 3 couples sued the Center for Reproductive Medicine in Mobile after 5 frozen embryos from the couples were accidentally destroyed. The lone dissent came from Justice Greg Cook, who criticized the majority decision by saying that it would curtail IVF in the state. And this is why I'm bringing the story up. I think it's pretty easy for Christians to agree that the destruction of an embryo is the destruction of a pre-born human. But there are much further moral and political implications here. Here's what Justice Greg Cook dissented. No court anywhere in the country has reached the conclusion the main opinion reaches. And the main opinion's holding almost certainly ends the creation of frozen embryos through in vitro fertilization, IVF, in Alabama, he said. So he's saying that not only will this decision give legal precedent for legal recourse against damaged embryos in the process of IVF, but that this decision creates precedent for dismantling IVF across the board. Now, why would he say that or reach that conclusion? Well, let's consider the implications and more importantly, the moral question or questions this poses. First, let's begin with a brief explanation of in vitro fertilization. The Mayo Clinic explains this procedure as: in vitro fertilization, also called IVF, is a complex series of procedures that can lead to a pregnancy. It's a treatment for infertility, a condition in which you can't get pregnant after at least a year of trying for most couples. And the statistics demonstrate that roughly 2% of births per year are a result of this process. Let's continue. During in vitro fertilization, mature eggs are collected from ovaries and fertilized by sperm in a lab. Then a procedure is done to place one or more of the fertilized eggs, called embryos, in a uterus, which is where babies develop. So a woman undergoes some type of hormonal therapy or treatment to mature the eggs within the ovaries. The eggs are collected. The semen of the father is collected. They fertilize one or more eggs, as they said, outside the womb, which is what we call conception, creating what is scientifically and medically known as an embryo or a zygote. In other words, the embryonic stage is the very first stage of life. After they've created numerous embryos, some, not all of them, are placed in the woman's uterus. Once there, the hopes are that at least one of them, what's called a blastocyst, will implant itself inside the uterine wall. And if that's successful, this is where the baby begins to truly take shape and develop. But what happens if numerous embryos implant? Well, we'll come back to that. Let's finish covering the process. IVF can be done using a couple's own eggs and sperm, or it may involve eggs, sperm, or embryos from a known or unknown donor. In some cases, a gestational carrier, someone who has an embryo implanted in the uterus, might be used. The last part is what's known as surrogacy, or when a woman carries someone else's baby. Now, in the initial process of IVF, numerous embryos are created, and some, not all, are used for the procedure. So what happens to the rest of them? Well, a lot of them are abandoned and ultimately destroyed. A minority of them are donated or used for research, and in the latter case, their destruction is, once again, the end result. So how often does this happen? Well, apparently a lot. In fact, fertility clinics are often left with unwanted, or as they say, abandoned embryos en masse. NBC News reported on this back in 2019, saying, "The dilemma is an unanticipated and unwelcome byproduct of the considerable advances made in assisted reproductive technology in recent years, causing concern among bioethicists, attorneys, religious groups, and the medical community." The reasons patients choose to abandon embryos vary. Storage fees for frozen embryos typically run from $500 to $1,000 a year and can climb even higher depending upon the clinic. Dr. Arthur Kaplan, one of the nation's leading bioethicists and a professor at the New York University Medical School, stated there are at least 90,000 frozen embryos considered abandoned in the U.S. Other studies indicate the number is much higher, possibly in the millions. Though clinics have different definitions, an abandoned embryo generally refers to a situation in which a patient has not paid storage fees related to a frozen embryo for 5 or more years and fails to respond to letters and calls from the clinic. Some clinics consider embryos abandoned after as little as a year. Then later in the article, NBC interviewed a recipient or a participant of IVF, a woman named Sarah Raber. She began treatments in 2008. After several rounds, Raber and her husband had 2 sons in 2010 and in 2012 in New York. Both boys were conceived through the transfer of fresh embryos into Raber's uterus. Other embryos were frozen during her treatments. So she began the IVF process in 2008, but in 2010 and 2012, she used, as they said, fresh embryos. So what happened to all the embryos from 2008? Raber said she had the option of using frozen embryos when she began trying for a second child, but opted to use the new eggs instead. "I knew I wanted to have the frozen embryos for a rainy day," Raber explained. "They were my insurance policy." In other words, in case these fresh embryos didn't work out, I'll use some of those that we've got on ice in the back room. But the story continues. Raber said she tried to use one frozen embryo to have a third child in 2014, but suffered a painful miscarriage. That's when she struggled with the decision of what to do with her 5 remaining embryos. So after a terrible miscarriage, Sarah was done with the frozen children, but didn't know what to do with them. She said, "Even though I knew I was done procreating, it was very hard to make the final decision," Raber said. "For months, I sat on the paperwork." The clinic gave Raber 4 choices. She could continue to pay storage fees for her frozen embryos, donate them to another woman, authorize the clinic to destroy them, or give them to the lab for research purposes. So paying the storage fees, donating them to someone else, and notice the last 2 options: authorize the clinic to destroy them, or donate them for research, which, again, what happens when they're done with the research. Ultimately, Raber donated her embryos to her fertility clinic's lab for research purposes. "I didn't want to donate them to a stranger," Raber explained. "I felt like if I donated the embryos to a stranger, it would be our child out there that we weren't raising." Well, that's interesting she came to that conclusion. If donating them to a stranger feels like giving your child to someone else, why doesn't keeping them on ice feel like freezing them? Or donating them to a lab feel like a human experiment? Or destroying them feel like abortion or murder? The National Institutes of Health reports that 2.5 million IVF cycles have produced about 500,000 babies. What does that tell you? That means a staggering 80% of embryos are indefinitely frozen or they're destroyed. And that's the case if only one embryo is created in the IVF process. But the truth is, on a usual basis, there are numerous embryos created in the process, meaning that the statistic probably far underreports the truth. Now, I've spelled out the ethical dilemma of IVF, but there are more moral dilemmas and political ramifications associated with this, especially for us as Christians. Now, this is me looking forward, not looking back, not punching down, not judging anyone for mistakes they may have made. I understand the incredibly sensitive issues of infertility. I've known people and friends who have had this problem. I have ministered to people like this. This is a conversation about the present looking forward. But I'm going to come back to this issue of infertility later. People use IVF for a number of reasons. The main and obvious reason is infertility, but there are others, and we'll talk about more of them in just a minute. But for example, a woman could have fallopian tube damage, ovulation disorders, endometriosis, uterine fibroids, which are tumors on the uterus. A man can have issues with sperm, but the science and technology of IVF is a means to an end, okay? Whereas the end is children and growing families, and that end is wonderful. Children are a blessing from the Lord, and most advanced societies are underproducing. We're not having enough kids. However, and I want you to hold on to this, because we're going to totally flesh this out. The ends don't justify the means. Now, all the stuff that I'm about to say is for the Christians listening. Okay, so if you're not a follower of Christ, you may want to skip ahead 20 minutes or so. So I'll give you just a second. And all right, now that they're gone, here are the moral problems posed by IVF as we've understood it. First of all, from the very beginning, the very start, there is a moral problem in obtaining the materials necessary for an embryo. And again, I'm talking about Christian morality here, which we believe to be the true and ultimate morality, that which comes from the holiness of God. The eggs are medically extracted from the mother, but how is the semen and the sperm obtained from the father? By masturbation, which is undoubtedly autosexual, a perversion of God's sexual standards. Secondly, as Christians, we believe that life begins at the moment of conception. When the embryo or the zygote is created, it's a person. And we'll talk more about this in a moment, but I'm actually going to show you that we're a person before that moment. But in IVF, a person is basically created in a petri dish. Some of them are frozen, which, in my opinion, is immoral in itself. But it's at this stage that most clinics can tell you all sorts of information about the embryo. You know, this one is turning out to be a boy or a girl. This one seems to have some genetic issues. And like flipping through a catalog, parents can choose which embryos to work with or destroy. Here's pro-life activist Lila Rose talking about this.
Advances with IVF has permitted parents to have a screening process where they can make sure that the baby that they're bringing into the world has desirable traits and has no genetic defects. So what happens in many clinics is these children are subjected to genetic testing to ensure they fit the parameters of what the parents want. You see this a lot even before the fertilization of that embryo, when the parents, if it's like a same-sex couple, is shopping for an egg or a sperm of another individual. And so you actually see them setting the bar for what they want in that egg donor per se.
So these are placed within the uterus. In some, not all cases, the game here is let's see which ones take. Now, let's say that a woman has 3 embryos that implant within the uterus, meaning she's going to have 3 babies at once. They're technically not triplets. Most of these cases go through something called selective reduction. Here's Lila Rose talking about that.
Tragically, in many cases, there's some famous stories out there of women who actually share in their Slate article, writing about how, oh, I implanted 3, I only wanted 1 or 2, the babies all took, and now the doctor's telling me it's dangerous to have triplets, so I'm going to selectively reduce, is what they use, the language they use. Selective reduction is the euphemistic language that's used to talk about these babies. And what that is an abortion, often a second trimester abortion, because that's kind of when you know whether they'll take or not, so to speak. If they've made it through the first trimester, that's when most miscarriages happen. So they're in the second trimester. It's like, oh, the baby hasn't died yet. It's still alive. Dang it. We better selectively reduce. And so what is legal in this country is you can go in and a baby that you intentionally conceived. This wasn't like a one-night stand and an accidental conception and you're like, I don't want responsibility. You paid money to conceive this new little life. And now you think, oh, I don't want this baby anymore because it was supposed to die and it didn't. So I'm going to go in and kill it. I'm going to go in and abort it.
So that's selective reduction, which is otherwise known as abortion, or to us as murder. It's in this same exact stage that parents in IVF or parents through a natural pregnancy will selectively reduce or murder babies with Down syndrome or Edwards syndrome. All of this would have made Margaret Sanger extremely proud. One of the best ways you can help our show, other than by sharing the content today, is by picking up some We the Free merch at wethefreeshow.com. You can be the salt and light you were meant to be by wearing the Salt and Light shirt, or by sipping your coffee from the Salt and Light mug, or you can sport the God Bless America shirt, and of course, the classic We the Free crest tee. We've even got stickers and a Smells Like Freedom candle. That's right. So check out our new merch at wethefreeshow.com. All of this to say, our second moral problem is that of murder, or the biblical taking of an innocent life. This is why Christians, and I mean the real followers of Christ, are completely 100% opposed to abortion, which is a difficult subject to talk about, admittedly. But our moral position must extend to the embryos, which are humans in their earliest living stages, the very beginning. So we have the immorality of masturbation, the unethical freezing and study of embryos, cryopreservation, and the murder of these preborn people. Then you have the issues of surrogacy. Personally, I see 2 problems here. The first is in a real marriage with a man and a woman who cannot conceive. They try IVF, and let's say the woman is physically unable to carry a child, and the couple seeks a surrogate mother. Another woman effectively rents out her womb, raises the child within herself for 9 months, gives birth to the baby, and then never sees the child again. There's just something wrong and totally unnatural about that. But the second issue, and the worst problem, is that of homosexual couples shopping around to pay certain people for her eggs and his sperm so they can create in a laboratory the most ideal child possible. They pay a woman to grow and give birth to the baby, and then that child never knows either his biological mother or the woman who gave birth to him or her, not to mention growing up in a homosexual household. And there's even some single people who will do this as well. There's so many immoral problems and slippery slopes with IVF and surrogacy. Albert Mohler Jr., who we'll quote extensively later, he wrote the following: "Thanks to IVF, the entire process can now be made into a market for babies as commodities, with sperm and eggs and embryos and rental wombs available in a dark market." Okay, so you've heard me say a lot, and you've heard me quote lots of people, but now let's look at God's Word. Here's the main point of the day, and this is something my pastor, Dr. Rocky Ramsey, says. Before you're a fetus or a baby, you are a person. John MacArthur wrote this: God's power is magnified in the development of human life before birth. In other words, in the eyes of God, you are a person before you're even physical. Look at this scripture in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5. This is the very first thing that God says to Jeremiah. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. So not only is God the giver of life, but he knows us before we are physically fashioned. King David expressed pretty much the same thing in Psalm 139, 13 through 16. For you formed my inward parts. You wove me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret. Your eyes have seen my unformed substance. That Hebrew word there for unformed substance is golem, which means embryo. And in the later Hebrew, or the Aramaic, it means unfinished vessel. King David also said, and in your book were all written the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them. So Paul expresses something very similar in Galatians 1:15, saying, but when God, who had set me apart even from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, was pleased. And he goes on from there, but the point is that God himself recognizes us as a person with life before us prior to our being physical. And this was understood by even the most liberal founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, who wrote about natural law or God-given liberties in the Declaration of Independence. You've heard this a million times. Thomas Jefferson wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident. They're obvious. That all men are created equal. They're created, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, God, the Creator, gives us the right to life. And Jefferson understood, as we as Christians understand, that life is an unalienable right, meaning the government can't take that right away from you. Parents can't take that right away from their children. And even earlier than Jefferson, John Locke understood that you don't even have the right to take your own life. Life is the basis of everything. It is the basic right above all rights and undergirding every other right. Now, we can talk about the forfeiture of that right to life and capital punishment some other time, or you can read John Locke's 2 treatises of government to remedy this seeming contradiction. But the point I make for all Christians is that our defense of life and the unborn must extend to the earliest stages of human development and oppose in vitro fertilization and the murder of these children in the embryonic stage. Now don't worry, I'm going to get to alternatives. But the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that extrauterine children outside of the womb and their expiration were not exempted from state laws covering wrongful deaths of minors, and therefore they enjoy legal protection. R. Albert Mohler Jr., president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, had this to say on the ruling. In a stunning development, the Alabama Supreme Court just declared that IVF embryos are legally defined as children under the state's law and constitution, and thus deserve protection whether or not they reside in a woman's womb. The 8-1 decision has set off a firestorm, with many predicting the end of IVF procedures in the state. But there's another firestorm that still needs to happen, and that will require pro-life Americans to answer some hard questions many have been working overtime to avoid. In incredibly clear language, Justice J. Mitchell stated, all parties to these cases, like all members of this court, agree that an unborn child is a genetically unique human being whose life begins at fertilization and ends in death. No one said this issue was easy or unemotional, but Alabama's highest court has just put it on the nation's agenda and it falls squarely on the Christian conscience. The court's reasoning is unassailable. A human embryo is a human being, wherever that embryo may be found. If that is not true, the pro-life movement has been lying. If it is true, then evangelicals had better make certain our affirmation of human dignity and the sanctity of human life is clear. All unborn children are children. And this leads us to the political ramifications of all this. The reason why the liberals are losing it over this state ruling is the legal precedent it potentially creates for further destroying the murderous industry of abortion, which is an incredibly wonderful thing. Lila Rose said the following: "This decision made by the Alabama Supreme Court affirms the scientific reality that a new human life begins at the moment of fertilization. Each person, from the tiniest embryo to an elder nearing the end of his life, has incalculable value that deserves and is guaranteed legal protection." Albert Mueller Jr. also said, "Critics charged that the decision would shut down all IVF procedures in the state and that the effects would ripple out, threatening far more than IVF. Some on the left immediately charged that this would further complicate pro-abortion arguments. They are surely right, and thankfully so. The hard thing is that many who consider themselves to be pro-life have refused to extend their own logic to the huge moral crisis posed by IVF procedures. The blunt and unavoidable question is this: do pro-lifers really believe that unborn children are children? If not, we have been lying. If we really do believe this, how do we reckon with millions of frozen children locked in an indefinite freeze and destined for destruction due to IVF procedures? Well, I believe that we would be serving God's will by petitioning our local politicians to enact similar measures and by encouraging others to seek alternatives. For example, there's something called NAPRO technology treatment, which is short for natural procreative technology. It's an innovative method that respects the natural biological processes of fertility and instead seeks to optimize fertility by examining genetic history, menstrual and fertility cycles, hormones, etc. It's fertility care instead of fertility control. There's also domestic infant adoption, adopting a newborn baby who has been orphaned for whatever reason. There's international adoption. There's fostering or fostering to adoption with older kids who are quite frankly unwanted by their parents. And finally, there's snowflake adoption, which is adopting the embryos that we've just talked about, that have just been left to ultimate destruction. All of these are infinitely morally superior to in vitro fertilization because, again, the ends do not justify the means. And listen, children are an amazingly wonderful thing. I've got 2 of my own and we want more children. They aren't the problem here. The kids are not the problem. Any child that has ever been produced by any means is a blessing. And that goes for kids produced by IVF, kids produced by premarital sex, kids produced by something as awful and horrible as rape or as inappropriate as incest. It doesn't matter. Children are a blessing from God that must be protected. Even the ones who are made in a petri dish or the ones that are just forming in the womb. Now, we have 2 leading candidates for president, President Biden and President Trump. Let's see what both of them had to say on this specific ruling. President Biden said, "The disregard for women's ability to make these decisions for themselves and their families is outrageous and unacceptable. Make no mistake, this is a direct result of the overturning of Roe v. Wade." So just remember that connection that he's trying to make there. Here's a We the Free fact check for the president. Alabama banned abortion in 2019, 3 years before Roe v. Wade would be overturned. This ruling is simply a logical expansion of something that they cited in that court ruling, the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act, which has been around for years. But Mr. President, look at what it says. And if you can't make out the letters, I'll read it to you. When the death of a minor child is caused by the wrongful act, omission, or negligence of any person, persons, or corporation, or the servants or agents of either the father or the mother as specified in section 65390. And that referenced statute is saying, and the remainder of this statute says, the parents basically have an equal right to commence an action, a legal action, for an injury to their minor child. So the Alabama Supreme Court is simply saying that these embryos are children too. Therefore, in the specific case of those embryos being destroyed against the wishes of the parents, obviously, they can now take legal recourse against whatever institution they used. In other words, this has nothing to do with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, but this very case itself could lead to more problems for the pro-death cult or the pro-choice crowd, as Mueller stated. Now, what about the other candidate? A certain Donald Trump, who installed the so-called conservative justices on the Supreme Court, who ultimately flipped abortion legislation back to the states. What did he have to say on this issue? Under my leadership, the Republican Party will always support the creation of strong, thriving, healthy American families. We want to make it easier for mothers and fathers to have babies, not harder. Like the overwhelming majority of Americans, including the vast majority of Republicans, conservatives, Christians, and pro-life Americans, I strongly support the availability of IVF for couples who are trying to have a precious baby. Well, I guess that makes me the underwhelming, all lowercase minority of Americans who thinks IVF is riddled with immorality and bioethical problems. And this is also coming from a person who supports abortion in cases of rape and incest, and it should be a little bit alarming to you that Trump shares the same opinion as Joe Biden on this. I honestly think that Republicans are failing to realize the political trap being set for them on this issue, and Trump has fallen right into it. They want to make it seem like they're all gung-ho for IVF, but it's really about abortion for them because it undermines their whole argument. Again, IVF has moral problems from the very start, and they only multiply out from the beginning. But perhaps with very much regulation, IVF could be fixed of its amoral issues. Until then, I would encourage you to utilize NAPRO technology, adoption, and fostering. Thanks for watching this clip. Listen, I want to make sure that you stay informed on the news and the biblical response to it. So do yourself and us a favor and hit the subscribe button before you go. And then we would love for you to check out WeTheFreeShow.com to grab yourself some merch, to spread the word about We the Free. And we're also going to put a video on the screen right now that we think that you'll love. Now, go and be the salt and light, and we'll see you next time right here.